From ContainerDays Hamburg, this video is proudly presented by Dax IT.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and thanks very much for coming along to the talk. So, when we're talking about Kubernetes security, a lot of talks and articles will focus on the idea of how might someone break into a cluster? What are the kind of weaknesses they could exploit? What sort of things could they do to get in? And also, how could you stop them doing that? But for this talk, I want to take a slightly different approach and talk about what happens after they broke in. What can they do within a cluster? What are some of the things they might try and do to persist or to expand their access? And as we go through this talk, I also want to use this as an opportunity to kind of explore some of the lesser known areas of Kubernetes and container stacks, and hopefully provide some new information, things you might not know about how Kubernetes works. That's definitely the goal of the talk. So, before I get started, a little bit about me. Why am I up here, standing up here giving this talk? So my background is in information/IT/cybersecurity, whatever we're calling it this year. And I've been doing that for quite a while now. I've been focusing on container security. I realized this the other day, it's been 10 years. So it's been a while now. It doesn't feel like 10 years, but it has been. My day job is that I'm a senior security researcher and advocate for Datadog. If you haven't heard of Datadog, we are a large observability and security company. I do a couple of things in the Kubernetes community to try and help out security-wise. I'm a co-author of the CIS benchmarks for Docker and Kubernetes. So if you've ever used a CSPM product in your environment or a KSPM product, you've probably encountered checks that come from the CIS benchmark. And if you've ever had problems resolving those, I'm sorry. More seriously, if you ever do use those things and you actually think this check isn't right, we actually do take feedback. So please do give us feedback. There's a website you can go to. It's very useful. I also participate in the Kubernetes project itself as part of SIG Security. We're the special interest group on security. And if any of the talks, either this talk or other talks you see over the next couple of days, kind of fires an excitement around Kubernetes security, please do come along. We meet every other week on Fridays, just a Zoom call, and we're a very friendly bunch, and we talk about all things security and Kubernetes related. Also, lastly, just down the bottom there, you might have noticed on the Kubernetes doc page, if there's ever something about warning you about security things, you'll see the little goose there. And that is the logo of SIG Honk, who are a group of people who like hacking around with Kubernetes. And that is the origin of why that is on the Kubernetes doc site. Anyway, let's get on with the story. So, our story today starts in one of Hamburg's lovely cafes. A Kubernetes cluster administrator is having his morning coffee and working on his cluster. And then, unfortunately, he has had a call from his CTO, which means he has to step outside of the cafe. Probably something to do with AI and costs, I imagine. And he's out there taking his call. And unfortunately for him, he has left his laptop unlocked on the desk in the cafe. Also, very unfortunately for him, there are some shady types in this cafe who happen to be Kubernetes hackers. And they have, say, about 30 minutes to try and get access and persist access to this cluster and get as much as they can in the time they've got while the admin is outside taking his phone call. So the question for the talk today is, how much could they do? What can they do? So first question might be, where could they hide? What sort of things could they attack? Well, clusters are made up of layers. There are a number of layers that exist in pretty much every Kubernetes cluster. We have containers. So containers run our applications, and every Kubernetes cluster has got containers. So there might be opportunities there, right? Because containers sometimes contain secrets that they need to do their work. Maybe our attackers could attack those and get secrets. We then have cluster nodes. In almost every cluster, there are nodes which are Linux virtual machines. Linux VMs can be a great place for attackers to attack and hide because they might give access to even more containers. They might have secrets themselves. We might be able to run binaries on container nodes as a good place to persist our access for long-term compromise and kind of retention of access. We then have the cluster itself. So Kubernetes is made up of a number of APIs. Perhaps our attackers could use those to actually persist their access and retain access. Maybe they could retain access to those APIs and use that to get more access to things they want. And then we have the cloud. Now, the cloud obviously is a huge topic, and I am not going to try and cover that in this talk. It's very much its own talks. So today we're going to talk about containers, we're going to talk about nodes, and we're going to talk about the cluster. And we're going to see where attackers might go and hide. Some of the ideas they might do, some of the things they might try and trick, and use it to kind of retain unauthorized access to environments. So let's start. Our attackers have sat down at the laptop. They've noticed the admin is not paying any attention. They're focused on their phone call. What do they want to do? Well, the first thing an attacker might want to do is get a root shell on a node, right? A root shell on a node sounds like a great place to start if I'm trying to hack into something. In the old days, or some years ago, I used to be a pen tester, and I used to pen test and security review Kubernetes clusters. As such, I had a set of Kubernetes manifests that I used to use as part of my job. And I had this one that I used to really like called node root. And all it did was basically create a pod that gave me root access to a cluster node. And it was super useful, and I used to carry it around and use it. But we don't need to do that anymore. Attackers don't need that, because Kubernetes has got inbuilt functionality to give you root shells on nodes, which as attackers is incredibly handy, which is the kubectl debug command. The Kubernetes project itself tends to take the view, as far as I can see, that if you're administering a cluster, you do everything via kubectl, right? So everything is done via the Kubernetes APIs, as opposed to like SSH or any other access. So they gave us the command kubectl debug, and it can drop root shells on nodes, which is a great thing to do. So, because why not? Let's do it live. I've got a Kubernetes cluster here. This is a stock GKE cluster. This could be any distribution. GKE is just the one that I'm using for these demos. They pretty much all work the same way. And if I do kubectl get nodes, we can see that my cluster has got 2 nodes. Now, this will work the same if you have 2 nodes, 20 nodes, 200, 2,000 nodes. Doesn't matter. But I'm paying the cloud bill for these demos, so it's 2 nodes. It's not going to be 200. So we've got our 2-node cluster, and we want to get a shell on it, right? So how do we do that? We're going to do kubectl debug node, and we'll have the first one. We're going to want a shell, so we'll have -it. And this next bit is important, and you might not know this because I didn't know this for a long time. There are different profiles in kubectl debug, which give you different levels of access to the host. The one we're going to use is profile sysadmin, because that gives us all the access, and we're nasty attackers who want all the access. So that's what we're going to do. And then we're going to tell it what image we want to use. It doesn't really matter. We'll say busybox. I'm going to hit enter. Oh, and it would help if I had actually completed the node command, wouldn't it? I thought I had completed that. X9L. Okay. It's going to go away, and it's going to create us a pod. And now we're going to see whether the demo is, okay, well, that's a good start. Okay, we're then going to issue the command chroot host. So when you're using kubectl debug, what it does is it actually mounts the host file system at /host inside your debugging container. So we can do chroot /host. And at that point, who am I root? Awesome. I now have a root shell in the node. I can do anything I want to this node because I am the real root user. And as an attacker, that's a great start. Right? We're like 5 minutes in. I already have root shell in the node. So great start for the attackers. They're having a good morning. But that's only part of the story, right? That's a shell. That's ephemeral. It's going to go away. The admin's going to come back to their laptop, and we can't be sitting here typing stuff on their screen when they turn up. So we need to get more access than this. So what do we need to do now? The demos are working. Awesome. The next thing we need to do is we need to execute some commands, right? We want to download our hacker tools onto this node so that we can use them in the cluster. Now, an obvious way of doing this might just be wget or curl, right? I just curl some binaries down and run them. That actually might not work as well as you'd hope, because a lot of Kubernetes distributions have started hardening the node OS. And so, for example, the cluster I'm using here, GKE, uses container-optimized Linux, and it essentially does things like mount things as no exec, or it mounts file systems as read-only. So our attackers might not have a great day just trying to download random binaries off the internet and run them. This might not work too well. But this is a Kubernetes cluster node. And because it's a Kubernetes cluster node, that means it can run containers, right? It has to be able to run containers because that's literally what it does for a living. So what we're going to do is we're going to go and get a container image. We're going to download that with all our tools in it, and we're going to run it. Along the way, we're going to explore a couple of features you might not know about containerd. So let's go. At this point, I'm going to start copy-pasting, because if I don't, I'm going to make more typos. And that's not going to be great. So what we're going to do is, first up, I'm going to use this command here, CTR. CTR is a debug client for containerd. From an attacker standpoint, the useful thing is it's installed in every single place containerd is. There are other better clients for containerd, like nerdcuttle, but they're not going to be installed necessarily. CTR, always going to be there. And we're going to do the command CTR namespace create sysnetmon. So containerd has the idea of namespaces, which is a way of organizing the containers inside a containerd instance. Confusingly, this has got nothing to do with Kubernetes namespaces and nothing to do with Linux namespaces, because naming things is hard, especially when it's namespaces. This is a completely different thing. And what we're going to do as attackers is we're going to create a new namespace. This means in the unlikely event that someone lists containers looking on this, unless they know to list containers in that namespace, they won't see our attacker container, which we don't want them to see. We're going to call it sysnetmon, because let's not make it obvious and call it attackers were here or something. We'll call it sysnetmon. So this gives us a new containerd namespace. So what do we do next? Well, what we're going to do next is we're going to go and pull an image from Docker Hub. So let's get that. And so we're going to pull this from Docker Hub. We're pulling an image here called user name is sysnetmon, and the image name is sysnetmon. Notably, this image has got nothing to do with systemd and nothing to do with network monitoring. It's a whole lot of hacking tools that I put in a container image. A very important point for security is if you're using Docker Hub, outside of the official images, they can contain anything. The name that they have does not in any way have to relate to what's in them. They can say that they are one thing and be something else entirely. So if you're ever pulling from Docker Hub, you have to be very careful that you trust the person that created the image, as in you know who the username actually is and you know what's in the image. Don't pull random stuff off Docker Hub. I know people do, because I've got quite a few images that I've used in demos, and I keep seeing people pull them off Docker Hub. My stats keep going up. One of them I've got 1 million pulls. I don't know who pulls it. And I could rickroll them if I felt like it, but I haven't done because maybe not, but I don't know who pulls them. Anyway, we're going to pull this image here, and this is going to come down, and this is going to give us our tools, all the tools we need to do all our hacking and things. And it is going to... Yeah, so we've now got our image down on the machine. So now we need to run a container based on that image. So we'll get this command. Long command is long. What we're going to do here is we're going to run a new container using CTR. We're going to give us the host network namespace. We're going to mount the entire host file system inside of our container. And we're also going to make this a privileged container. So this is going to give us all the access we need to do whatever we want. We hit that, and it says, sure, you can have a container. And then we're going to exec into it. So we're going to get a shell inside our container. Great, we've now got a shell inside our container. Now, importantly, none of what we did there would show up in Kubernetes audit logs, because we didn't touch Kubernetes. We did everything at the containerd layer on a given node. So if you're not monitoring what's happening with containerd, you wouldn't have spotted any of that if you're just relying on things like Kubernetes audit logs. Kubernetes audit logs are very important for other things, but not for that. But here we now actually have an environment in which we can run any commands we want. So I've got any tool I like, will run in this environment. That will always work. So again, happy days, right? Our attackers are doing quite well. Everything's going to plan. So take a sip of their coffee-based drinks and think about what they need to do next. Well, we still have some problems to solve as an attacker. And the next problem we have to solve is, how do I retain access to this container? Right, so I've got it running, and it's doing its stuff, but I need to retain access when we get kicked off this laptop in about 20 minutes' time. So we need some way of forming some sort of connection out to the internet to actually come back in at a later date and carry on our attacks. Now, there's lots of different attacking tools you can use for this. They typically get called what's called a C2 tool, so command and control. And there's lots of things you can get in like legitimate pen testing kits or kind of grey hat hacking tools. All of those, the slight downside is they tend to get flagged by malware software. So anti-malware software will go, hey, that looks like a hacking tool. I'm going to complain about this and warn people. So our attackers, being cloud native kind of people, have thought to themselves, well, let's think of another way we could do this that might be less likely to show up as being definitely malicious. And I get to talk about, I'm going to talk about that. I'll come back. Actually, one other thing I was mentioning, just before I go on though, because I always forget this bit, I could have done this another way. Instead of using containerd, I could have done this a different way. I could have used Kubernetes static manifests. This is a very handy feature of Kubernetes that isn't necessarily that well known. If you drop a thing that looks like a pod manifest into a specific directory dictated by the kubelet will start a pod using that manifest. And it will do that regardless, even if there's no API server to talk to. And this is how most Kubernetes clusters bootstrap themselves. They use static manifests to actually load up the components that run the cluster. So I could have done this. Now, when a kubelet does this, it registers that pod with the API server. So it says, hey, Mr. API server, here is a new pod that's been created. So it would show up in, if you do kubectl get pods, unless you give the pod an invalid namespace name. If you give the pod an invalid namespace name, the kubelet will still create it. It will try to register it with the API server, and the API server will go, nope, don't know about that Kubernetes namespace, not registering it. The pod, however, will still be running. So if you ever want to create a pod and it's kind of hidden from Kubernetes, just stick it in the manifest directory, and it'll happily do it. Just give it an invalid namespace. Call it something you like. So that would be another way I could have done the same thing, more or less. We did containerd. It's fine. There's lots of different ways to do this. Anyway, let's get back to the idea of how do I get access? How do I retain access? So we're going to use my favorite piece of networking software ever, which is Tailscale. Because Tailscale is really, really cool. If you don't use Tailscale, I've got to recommend you should look into it. It's great for our attackers. And there's a number of good reasons why it's really useful for our attackers. One of them is a thing called derp. So if Tailscale can't get access any other way onto its network, what it does is it uses their relay network. Tailscale maintain a relay network. All the attacker needs to have in terms of outbound access is 443 TCP outbound. Now that is the most common thing to be allowed out of networks because it's TLS connections to the internet. So most clusters are going to let that connection out from a node to the outside world, 443 TCP. If it can make that connection, it can do the relay, and all the attackers do is they need 443 TCP from wherever they're coming from. So that part of Tailscale is really useful because essentially it means we don't have to worry about like funny networking connections or firewalls in almost every case. But we can actually get it all set up. And there's a couple of other features of Tailscale which we'll talk about, which are also really useful. So where are we? Here. One of the really cool features about Tailscale is it consists of two static binaries that are Golang binaries. And you can rename them. So you don't have to have them be called Tailscale. You could, for example, rename them systemd netmon server and systemd netmon client, and they will work just the same way as if you called them Tailscale. So we can run this, which is our systemd netmon server, and we can also run this, which is our systemd netmon client. And if you did a process list on this host, potentially looking for things that shouldn't be there, all you would see is systemd netmon server and systemd netmon client. And the question you have to ask yourself is, would you recognize that automatically as malicious? Or would you think it was just something that GKE had put onto your host and was running for you? Depends on how well you know your process lists. Anyway, that gives us our setup. And then what we can do is I've got a Tailscale console, if things are working. Let's reload that, see if it's going to turn up. There we go. What we've got here is we have got a new thing. We've got our cafe bot. So we've called it cafe bot because it's in the cafe. But what we've done here is I'm going to make another one of use of another one of their features, which is ACLs. So Tailscale has ACLs, which means you control what access things have. Now this is a bot. We don't want it talking to the rest of our tailnet because we don't want it to find out what else is there. So we're going to give it a little ACL tag, and we're going to give it the tag bot. And that means that I can connect to it, but it can't connect back out to me. So we're going to lock it down so we can connect to it, it can't connect to us. So assuming that that has all worked, we should be able to do Tailscale status. And we can see, yep, there is our cafe bot. It has turned up in our tailnet. And then what we can do is we can do Tailscale. This command sometimes doesn't work, but let's see if it's going to. Cafe bot. Yay. Right, I've now Tailscaled in to the container. Now, importantly, you see I did Tailscale SSH there. Tailscale actually embeds an SSH server in it, so SSHD will not show up anywhere on this host. All you will see is systemd netmon server and systemd netmon client. But it does give me full SSH functionality to actually go in and actually get access to my environment. Excellent. Our attackers are still having a great time. We now have a persistent connection that we can come back to after we get kicked out of the cafe, and we've got access to the node. This is looking good. But we are missing a very important piece of the puzzle. We don't have any creds. The creds we're using, the credentials we are using, are the admin's credentials. We can't walk away and take those away with us because GKE essentially authenticates back to the cloud periodically, those credentials will expire and we won't have access anymore. As attackers, what would be really handy is if we had some high privileged credentials that didn't expire, because then we could come back whenever we wanted and to our little SSH session here and merrily misuse those credentials. So that sounds like a thing we should do. So, back to the slides briefly. How are we going to do that? Well, there's another thing which we can do, which is we would also kind of like for the things we want to do not to show up in the main API audit logs. It would be kind of super annoying if someone saw something in the audit logs and then found us and kicked us out. It would be nice if we could do things like execute commands and containers without talking to the API server. And to do that, we're going to use the Kubelet API. So the Kubelet API, this is a kind of slightly lesser known and not dreadfully well documented feature of Kubernetes, which is every kubelet runs an API, runs on 10.250 TCP on every single node in the cluster. And you can talk to the Kubelet API if you have credentials with the correct permissions. So typically you need access to node proxy objects inside the Kubernetes API, the main API. If you have those rights, you can talk to the kubelet. Anything you do to the Kubelet API does not show up in audit logging. There is no audit logging. You can't turn it on. It's not a feature that's available. So if anyone talks to the Kubelet API, what they do will not be visible. Okay, let's see if we can get some credentials to do that, because that sounds like the kind of thing we really like as attackers. What I'm going to do here, I'm going to have a different shell. And where are we? This one. I'm going to explain this command in the next slide, so I won't go too much into it at the moment. But I'm going to create a new user called kubeAPI server. Now, this is an existing user in the cluster, and I'm just going to create a new set of credentials for that user. And this user has got rights to the Kubelet API. So we're going to do that, and it hopefully should work. Yeah, it's created. I'll explain how that worked in a second, don't worry. Oh. But we're going to, for the time being, I'm going to copy that to the, and then we need to remember it's called, and then we're going back into our container. We're going to create a file. So we're going to get a little kubeconfig file. And then we should be able to do this. So we've got a set of credentials running inside our container that have got access to the Kubelet API. We're then going to use a cool program called Kubelet. Kubelet sounds like an official utility, isn't. It was written by some researchers from CyberArk. They basically got annoyed that there was no easy way to interact with the Kubelet API, and they essentially reverse engineered it from the source code of Kubernetes, where you can find the information. It's not really that well documented apart from there, but you can go look in the source code. And they came up with Kubelet. And what we can do with Kubelet is we can do something like that. Now that lists all the pods running on this node, talking to the Kubelet API. Importantly, these credentials work on every node in the cluster. So again, if we had 2,000 nodes, you would just change that IP address and from 127.0.1 to the IP address of another node, and you would be able to list all the pods. You would also be able to exec commands on all of the pods in the cluster. So for example, if I wanted to list secrets in pod or something like that, list the environment of the pod, do anything you can think of to do inside the pod. And none of this would show up in the Kubernetes API logs because we're not talking to the Kubernetes API server. We're talking to the Kubelet API. So that sounds great. Excellent. I've now got creds. The creds, well, how long would they last is an interesting question, which I'm going to talk about next. Because the question is, well, how did you do that, Rory? You didn't talk to Google, and GKE, if you read GKE's docs, they'll tell you that all authentication is managed by Google Cloud. That's kind of not true, or it's not completely true, is the answer. Because we have a thing, this is my, and I know this is sad before I say it, this is my favorite Kubernetes API. This is the certificate signing request API. So Kubernetes has an API called the certificate signing request API. And what it allows you to do, if you have the correct permissions, is it allows you to issue new credentials for the cluster using client certificates. And from an attacker's perspective, this has a number of very useful features. First one is there is no persistent record of these credentials having been issued, unless you have audit logging turned on. So if you don't have audit logging turned on, someone uses the CSR API to create creds, basically that record gets cleaned up out of the API server. I think it's about 15 minutes or so. Once that's happened, there is no record that those credentials have been created at all. So that's useful. You also can't revoke the certificate for these. So these are client certificate users. You can't revoke them. There is an outstanding issue in Kubernetes 18982, which has been open for 9.5 years at this point, for certificate revocation to be added to Kubernetes. Unfortunately, I think after 9.5 years, we can all say that's probably not very likely to get closed anytime soon. So you can't revoke them, and you can't easily see them unless you have audit logging turned on. And essentially, you can create credentials for any user that exists in the cluster. So the one we did last time was the Kubelet, so it's a Kube API server user. That one has quite a lot of permissions. We're going to do another one now. Because at this point, some people in the audience might be thinking, Rory, why have you just spent the last 25 minutes talking about like getting shells on nodes and everything when there was a much simpler way of doing what you're trying to do? And the answer is because it was fun. Basically, we can use the CSR API to create credentials, and then as long as we have access to the Kubernetes API server at a network level, we can use those credentials from anywhere in the world. Now, you might say, who would be daft enough to put their Kubernetes API server directly connected to the internet? And the answer is, it's the default configuration on every single managed Kubernetes service I've ever seen in my life, including GKE, AKS, and EKS. So all of them will put the API server directly on the internet with no restrictions unless you tell them not to. This is not a default that I am fond of from a security standpoint. It's probably one of the worst things that the cloud providers did from a security standpoint, but at this point, it's reality. No one's going to change that default now. You can change the default when you set a cluster up, but you have to know to do it. So what we can do is we can actually go and kind of show how this works. And I'll explain what I was doing earlier on, because I promised I would explain how this command works. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to create a new credential, and I'm going to call it webhook config, and I'm going to clone a user called system GKE common webhooks. And one of the reasons as an attacker I would clone this user is if you looked in the audit log and you saw GKE common webhooks had some activity, would you really expect it to be malicious, or would you just think it's something GKE is doing for itself that it does to manage the cluster? The command I'm running here is tiastinus, which is, everyone wants to know, Gallic for certificate. And all this does, this is nothing clever, nothing hacky. It just automates the process of using the CSR API, approving the certificate, and creating a kubeconfig file, because I was kind of lazy and I didn't like doing it manually. So we hit enter on that, and it says, yep, sure, there is your credential. An important point, though, is the expiry date, 2030. That credential is valid for 5 years. I can come back 3 years down the line, and I can use this credential, and it'll still work if the cluster is still there. The default lifetime for these certificates varies per distribution. Usually a year. I don't know why GKE is 5 years. I have actually mentioned this to Google and said, did you really think that's a good idea? They said yes. So fine. I did report this to them because I was a bit thinking, really, is that seriously good? They said, yep, that's fine. We're cool. So we now have a credential that will give us access for 5 years. And it's a system credential, right? So the question would be, would you notice what it did? Now, what can this do? We can just do the usual auth can I list to say what rights have we got. Well, we've got get secrets at a cluster level. That's pretty useful. We've also got, let me see, we've got lots of rights. We've got pods, everything, services, everything, config maps, everything, validating munition webhooks, everything. We've got all the rights we could conceivably need, right? We can go back and we do anything to any pod in the cluster. We can get every single secret in the cluster. We can do whatever we want, and we do it for 5 years, and probably no one's going to notice we've done it, unless they're looking really carefully. And that's great, but there is one slight problem, not for our attackers today, but for some of their stuff later on, which is there's one big Kubernetes distribution that technique does not work in, and that's Amazon EKS. So Amazon EKS disabled the CSR API for authentication. For a long time, they didn't say why. There was just a GitHub issue with people complaining about it. And there was a lot of people saying because they didn't ever document why they'd done it. They've now documented that it's deliberate. They did do it deliberately. They haven't said why, but I'm hoping it's for security reasons, because that just seems like a really bad idea. So you might think, well, the attackers' days would be ruined if they hit Amazon EKS. And the answer is, well, not quite. Because there is another option, which is the token request API. So token request API is a really useful thing. It's how pods get service account tokens. So whenever your pod gets a service account token, the kubelet will say, if it's We'll look at the manifest and say, is it meant to have a service account? If the answer is yes, it'll talk to the service account controller and the token request controller and say, hey, can I have a new service account token? And it'll mount it into the pod. So it has a legitimate use case. However, anyone who's got the right permissions can use the token request API to create new tokens. And they can create them for any user that they've got rights to do so. So this works even in EKS. So we can use the token request API to do the same kind of thing. And essentially, we can recreate any service account. So if we're an admin, we can create any service account and duplicate that and create a token. Now, in terms of usefulness, it's not as good as 5 years. The expiry depends on distribution. EKS maxes, I think, to a day. GKE is 2 days. AKS was a year the last time I looked. So it depends on your distribution how well this works. But a diligent attacker could reissue the credential every day if they had the right permissions. They need to be a bit more careful about it, a bit more obvious in audit logs. But let's see how that would work. So we're going to create, because I get to kind of, again, show off something I think is fun. Oh, that's not the right one. Where are you? That one. Okay, we're going to use, this is another just little utility I wrote. It does nothing clever. It just uses token request API to create a JOT token and put it in the kubeconfig file. But we're going to do it to create a new token kubeconfig file for, and again, sad, my favorite service account, which is the cluster role aggregation controller in the kube system namespace, because this is a very special service account. One important thing about these is in terms of how you would react to this. Again, there's no persistent record that I've done this, so I could create 100 of these, and there's nothing in the cluster apart from, again, in audit logs. If you don't have audit logs turned on, you wouldn't notice. There's nothing that says 100 count tokens have been created, right, unless you're looking at audit logs. Also, in terms of revocation, you can't revoke these without deleting the service account that they relate to, and if you delete this service account, you'll break your cluster, probably, so be careful with that. But we can create a new kubeconfig file for that. And if I look at the rights for that, I'm going to get the command because I'm going to mess up if I don't. It kind of looks not that great. So I've just said this is a really cool service account. But all these rights here are rights that are just standard system authenticated rights. And then it doesn't really seem to have a lot of rights, except for here. It's got some rights to cluster roles. That's the one thing that it's got that isn't everywhere else. And the reason why it's my favorite service account is because of that, which is the escalate verb. This has got a verb called escalate to cluster roles. And you might not even have heard of the escalate verb before, but the escalate verb does exactly what it says, which is it allows me to escalate my privileges, which as an attacker is an awesome thing. So usually, even if you've got rights to create cluster roles, you can't create a cluster role that has more permissions than you already have, because that would allow privilege escalation. But this specific service account needs to be able to escalate its privileges to do its job. The history of this thing is it used to be cluster admin. You used to get *** across the top. And it was actually me, I reported and said, hey, do you really want this to be cluster admin? And they said no. So they gave it escalate, but honestly, it just adds an extra step to it because you can give yourself cluster admin again, as we're about to see. But right now, it's got the escalate verb, which is why it's my favorite service account. So what we can do, because it's got escalate, is we can just edit its own permissions. So we can just edit our own permissions using kubectl. So we can just say, use that kubeconfig. I just want to edit the rights of that thing, right? Edit our own rights, essentially. Ooh. Wi-Fi decided to have a bad day on the very last demo. Oh, come on. Almost all my demos worked, and you're going to give me something bad on the last one? Oh. That isn't going to play ball. You may have to take my word for it on the last one. Oh, disappointing. Come on. I'm going to carry on talking while oh, it did it eventually. I don't know why it decided to be slow all of a sudden. So what we can do is we can just go down here, go into our rules, go in there, and just add ***, right? And say, hey, I would really like to be cluster admin. Can I be cluster admin? And then, who's doing something? Who's torrenting things? No. Right, okay, it's done its stuff. So what we can do now is we can look at our rights again, and we can go up the top, and if that worked, yeah, there we go. ***. So I'm now cluster admin. So that will now give me all the rights to do anything I wanted, and I can just go in and take my rights away again once I'm finished. And that's every right. As we know, every right to everything. So even in EKS, if you've got the right access, you can do something like that, and you get all the access you ever wanted. So our attackers have had a great day, right? They've had their time, and it's all worked out, and they've had all their access. The admin's finishing up their call, coming back in, they step away from the machine, safe in the knowledge they've got persistent access, and they can wreak havoc in this cluster forevermore. So the question then becomes, what do we do about all this? This sounds bad. What could we have done here? What could have gone differently? How could have this not had the outcome it's just had? First thing, how do you detect all the things I just did? Kubernetes audit logs are incredibly important. If you don't have Kubernetes audit logs turned on, you will miss a lot of the very bad things that just happened there. Specifically, you will miss the CSR API and the token request API. If you had your audit logs turned on, you would notice, hey, why is an admin creating new client certificates for system accounts? That doesn't sound like the kind of thing that an admin should be doing on a day-to-day basis. Is there a ticket that relates to that? No. Oh, something bad might have happened. If you don't have audit logs turned on, there is no persistent record of what happened there, which is obviously not great. Node agents. I did some things on the node. If you've got node agents, they might spot it. I'd actually be interested to know whether people's, like if you've got EDR, XDR, or any of the kind of security agents, whether they would spot those. I think they might, depending on exactly how they're configured. Don't know. Node logs. Ensuring you have logs from the process running, right? What do you have that's running? Do you have all the logs? Are the logs, and indeed especially the audit logs, are they retained for long enough? Are they centralized and retained? You know, if someone did this, then 2 months down the line, an incident kicks off and you're trying to work out how they got in, would your audit log still be available to go and query to make sure you could go back and say, how could this have happened? Because attackers don't always do things like immediately on the day. Sometimes they'll wait a while. And then this last point here, it's something which sounds incredibly simple, but really isn't, which is, do you know what good looks like? Do you know what all of the cloud providers run on your clusters? Because I've looked at quite a few different cloud distributions, and all of the distributions have their own system processes, like things they run to actually help manage the environment, and a lot of them are quite different. Like they'll have different pods, different processes, different agents. I think it's very important to know what good looks like, because then you get some idea of going, hang on, there's never been a systemd netbon before. Why do we suddenly have a systemd netbon? I'd have some chance of spotting it. But that's how you detect it. So there's various options for detection at different layers. The other question is, how do you stop this? How could we have had this outcome be different? Well, first one, if you only do one thing after this talk, if you only actually make one change to your configurations, my recommendation would be take your clusters off the internet. Don't put your API servers directly on the internet. I know it's a default, but it's a bad default, because it means you're always one set of stolen credentials away from having a very bad day. The attacker literally just needs a kubeconfig file. So if you think of all the ways a kubeconfig file could be lost, right? It could be committed to GitHub. It could be some malware gets onto one developer's laptop, and they've got a kubeconfig file with static credentials in there. Suddenly you're going to have a very bad day. If your cluster isn't on the internet, it makes it harder for the attacker. They need to be able to get to the API server as well as having creds. It just lowers that risk of something very bad happening. And then the other one is a super boring old school security thing that security people have been talking around since I've been in security. Least privilege. Imagine that the admin sitting in the cafe wasn't cluster admin. If you think about what an admin generally needs to do on a day-to-day basis, debug node? Yeah, maybe. That's possible, because that's a troubleshooting activity. Does the admin need access to CSR API on a day-to-day basis? I would say absolutely not. That's a really unusual API. Why do you have access to that? Do they need the token request API directly? I would say probably not as well. You know, people don't need to do these things on a day-to-day basis. If this admin had just had the rights to like debug pods and nodes, which is probably most of what they do, then the attackers would have started running all those commands and they wouldn't have worked. They'd have said, nope, sorry, you don't have privileges to do those things. So I'll leave you with the words of the great Ian Coldwater on that topic, which is that we are all made of stars, but your RBAC should not be. Thank you. Yeah, I can do that. So how did your tool approve the CSR? I approved the CSR. It's not automatically approved by default, so you'd need the permissions to approve it. Yes. So the user I was using in this example was cluster admin. So they had all of the rights. So yeah, what you do is you first create the CSR, then you approve it, and then you download the approved certificate. So you do need those permissions. And that actually feeds very well into the point I was making at the end there. At least privilege. Does your admin need the rights to approve CSRs on a day-to-day basis? My argument would be no, they don't. That's not something people need to do. If you remove those rights from people using your cluster, you absolutely would block that CSR attack. And that CSR attack, in my experience, is really nasty because those CSRs, you can walk away and come back in years, which is not cool. So, yeah.
For that.
Any other questions in the room before I finish, or are we done?
You can scan the QR code and insert the questions, or
you can stick your hand up.
Or you find Rory after the talk.
Yeah, I'm around for the next couple of days, so if anyone wants to talk Kubernetes security, I'm always happy to do that. And if you're looking for me as well, my stuff was up there as well. So anyway, thanks very much.
From ContainerDays Hamburg, this video is proudly presented by DAX IT.